So this doctrine of liberalism, right, especially in the context of the modern world, right, it takes a different connotation in the Revolution era. But liberalism, really post-Civil War, is this belief that who should fix problems? Yeah, that we need more government to get involved, more government regulation, more government support, more government programs to fix problems. So where do we see the root of this idea of liberalism? Where does this really take hold in American politics, American popular politics? Brett, go ahead.
The New Deal, FDR's New Deal.
Yeah, FDR's New Deal is in fact this modern American foundation of liberalism. Sure, we can talk about the populists. Right? They were asking for more government regulation, more government involvement. We can talk about the progressives, absolutely. Right? But in both cases, they're more about regulating business so that things were fair. Both groups. More government involvement in business. In terms of the government involving themselves more in a social arena, to push for social progress, economic progress, political equality, we really see the real roots of modern liberalism in the New Deal. And then we see it in largely every president, to an extent, since FDR. Truman especially. Doesn't get a whole lot of success, but Truman pushes for these liberal-type policies. Eisenhower, to a smaller extent, because he's a Republican. Keep in mind, he says, I'm a modern Republican. I am fiscally or economically conservative, but socially liberal. Right? I want to be conservative in dollars and cents, but liberal with people. And then, of course, Kennedy's New Frontier. Sure, then he dies. Sorry, Leon. But then LBJ's Great Society is the perfect example. The Great Society is the perfect example of modern liberalism, of using the government to guarantee things like civil rights, voting rights, health care for old people, health care for poor people, Head Start programs. So all this LBJ domestic stuff would definitely be considered liberalism. What's maybe the downside of liberalism? If you can think of one. What's the downside of this approach to society?
Too much change.
Maybe too much change. Sure, change is hard sometimes. People don't like change.
Or how much government.
Yeah?
Too much power?
Too much power? How much government's too much government? I'm not asking for an answer, just for you to think about it, right? If we're looking at the government is there to solve the problem, at what point does the government become the problem? Right? Or if we're asking the government to solve all of our problems, what types of problems can't the government solve? Right? Josue pointed out a line that I love very much that I talked about during Reconstruction, also another example of liberalism, that you can't legislate morality. You can't create new programs that change people's minds, people's morals, people's ideals. So for the second question with the limits, it's just more you thinking about, because we're getting to a point, our last two lectures of the year talk about the limits of liberalism. That when America as a society pushes back on liberalism, and we, as you guys know, the pendulum always swings. Pendulum always swings back and forth. Right? We look at a significant amount of liberalism as in the growth of our government's policies post-World War II, really post-Great Depression. Right? 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s are going to be kind of a murky, in-between, weird time. People listen to disco and wear bell-bottom pants and do weird things. But definitely by the 80s, we have returned ourselves to conservatism. Right? And the question becomes, are there limits to what we can do as a country? And I think it's Vietnam that starts exposing those limits. That there are limits to how much our government should do. There are limits to what our government is capable of. There are limits to what America as a society can mobilize itself to solve. And that's why I think Vietnam is such a linchpin moment in American history, because it demonstrates to all of America what those limits are. And more than anything else, it demonstrates that those limits exist. America has this confidence crisis. Right? I thought we could do anything. Right? We put a man on the moon. But we can't solve this jungle uprising in freaking third world Vietnam. Right? We forced school integration. But we can't stop urban rioting in downtown cities like Los Angeles and Detroit. Right? We can force schools in Mississippi and Alabama to have black and white kids go to school together. But we can't stop urban communities from burning down their own homes and their own buildings and their own infrastructure. And that's kind of the grappling that takes place in this question of like, what is the limit of liberalism? That's why it's a phenomenal place to end our course today and Monday, because those are the questions that we still grapple with today. Those are the questions you will grapple with as you become college students and voters and people in the workforce, in the political arena, right, in higher education, in careers. So I think it's we end, I don't know, to me, in my opinion, we end the course with more questions than we have answers. But I think that's a healthy thing. I think it's a healthy thing. So today we'll talk about the response to liberalism. Right? If the 60s are a decade of change, of government programs, of aggressive government policies, of spending, of celebrating the wealth of the 1950s and the 1960s, the 1970s puts that all to a screeching halt. All of it to a screeching halt. We stopped trusting the government. We stopped trusting the American dollar. We stopped trusting this foreign policy. We stopped trusting the presidents. So the 70s turns into the antithesis of what was the 60s. And the 80s continue that push back towards conservatism. So your prompt is here. I would like for you today to evaluate how much the domestic and foreign policies of the 70s demonstrate change in American society. And we'll do so by looking at these things. These things. We'll look at the new left. If I say there's a new left, what else is there probably?
New right.
A new right. Love it, right? This new left that's embraced cultural progress instead of just economic and political progress. And then the new right, which embraces cultural conservatism. Right? It's the first time we'll really talk culture in our politics. Our politics to this point have largely been defined by role of the government, role in the economy, right? Civil rights, those types of things. Now we're talking about cultural elements of our religious affiliations, right? The Republicans are going to really double down on having the vote of evangelical Christians. So they're going to fight against things like affirmative action, things like abortion rights, things like right to choose and reproductive health. So we'll talk about our new party alignments. We'll talk about the end of liberalism. We'll talk about Nixon's foreign and domestic policy. Some of his foreign policy achievements. Some of his domestic policy achievements. There's a lot of good that takes place in the Nixon presidency, and it's obviously overshadowed by a lot of bad. A lot of bad. We'll talk about Ford's presidency after Nixon resigns. The only presidents in American history to never have been voted into office. Talk about that today. How that's possible. We'll talk about Carter's presidency. Poor Carter. Poor Carter. A good man, a good human, and just not a good president. I would argue that a lot of the things aren't his fault, but he just is not the man for the moment. And he's the reason that we get to Reagan in 1980 and then the legacies of the 60s and 70s. But first I want you to read about this new left versus new right ideology. First text on your left is part of a really important group called the Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS. You saw a lot of the outcomes of their movement already with things like student protests, shutting down college campuses. They're really going to start mobilizing in the early 60s, 1962. The Students for a Democratic Society. They're going to talk about how important it is to mobilize youth. And then you'll talk about kind of the way the 60s ends. I like this text on the right because it really demonstrates kind of the end of the 60s ideas of empowering youth. So read them both side by side, compare them, evaluate what is their different view, the two of them, on youth in the 60s. How do these two sources differ? I'm going to give you 5 to read it. I'll give you 5 to read it, and then we'll talk about how they differ. Go for it. Chop, chop. I'll pass back some work. I'll try to pass back for the test. How do these two sources differ on the way they view youth in society? Treated like part A of an SAQ. Text, use the text, leverage the text. What does the text have to say? You're there. My grandpa used to read eyes half shut, pretending like he's reading my text in that. Oh, is that right? Thank you for your wisdom, but I didn't ask for it. American Studies. They matter in 8+2. Disrespect. What? I need a response. How are they different in their views of the youth in the next minute and 10 seconds? Seconds. Get the red, get him red well. So that America's just trying to put that people to work to accept society, not what they want. And that's why they're well, get a job like your dad got a job, we'll sometimes you might get the socialization process. All right, take a minute to talk to your partner. How do these two views differ on the real role of youth in society? And how do they represent the two polar opposite views they're going to give us on 1970s? 1 minute, go for it. Go.
Arguing about while the youth thinks that youth is like the way it is, but they also agree for saying that they have a reason to want it because they also want society as
Use those words though, right?
they don't really know what's happening, that they don't take into consideration the actions that they're going to take into fix those problems. They cause it more violent. That's what I think.
The first one that says that this person is like you said, society from all they have the right
Alright, so what is this very important, it's a much longer text, but I figured on Thursday morning you were feeling a much longer text. This Port Huron statement. What is it trying to say about the youth? Chavez, thank you for your hand up, sir. Talk to me.
They do have the potential to make significant changes, which is why they're oppressed as much as they are.
Good. Talk to me, because this is a good question that popped up here. What are they being oppressed by? Oh, good answer. Put that in yours. They're being oppressed by everything.
Schools, courts, police.
Sure. Government. The government's oppressing them. They're creating policies. Yes, we're going to oppress these young people to screw them. Yes, society is establishing hierarchies that they're seeming to find oppressive. Look at the year on that. What year is that issued, that statement? So what are they being oppressed by? Conformity, the 1950s. See, we can review things as we actually teach. Then it's the 50s society of everybody fits in a neat little box, everybody does what they're supposed to do, everybody minds their own business, everybody goes to church. It's this conformity that means, that gives us this youth explosion of the 1960s. There's a lot of actual youth explosion in Vietnam as well. So, yeah. Sorry. I can never let an opportunity go. All right, talk about JFK's first and only inaugural. Things are fun. Somebody, I forget who it was. I have my 3 presidential ducks. What do I have? I have Nixon, I have Teddy, and I have Lincoln. All right, and then somebody in my APO class is like, "Oh, I'm gonna get you a JFK one neck." I'm like, "Cool. Does it come with a hole in the back?" How's it gonna float? That's weird. I heard more for JFK. Now, actually, probably didn't. You didn't feel it. Talk to me about this other perspective on the youth. Go ahead, and then go ahead. Go.
Something I pretty much discussed was that from an angry man talks up to youth, he's pretty much still comparing them to young children who don't know how to make proper decisions. He's also saying pretty much that for them to make a change, they still have to listen to the adults and the rules that are already implemented in society for you to make something happen.
What is he accusing them of being?
4-year-old.
Immature.
Ignorant 4-year-olds, irrational. Right? The things you're asking for are unreasonable, unnecessary. Go.
It's the opposite of the first one because the K. Ross.
Yeah.
The second one, it basically is kind of advocating for the young people to be socialized.
Yeah.
And fall into the same cycle that the conformists did.
Isn't it crazy? Right? But in the 60s, like, you guys are making too much noise. Like, get back in line. Shut up. What is he associated? What kind of movement is he associated with? What? The silent majority. Right? He's trying to silence these kids and say like go back to the way the things are supposed to be, like with kids stay in line, go to school, get a job, mind your own business, and then raise some kids and move on.
Even though the change is minimal, it's happening.
Yeah. He's saying, hey, change is slow. Why you not rush things? Right? Which people always say that enjoy the status quo. So turning your page. Nice to know on the text, guys. I like that. I want you to make sure you're exposed to the SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society. They're very visible at Berkeley at the time. All these more liberal, aggressive schools. So what we see is this impact of the 60s is this new left. It's younger. It's more minority-based. It much more resembles the Democratic Party today. Right? This new left that's focused on liberalism, on government support for programs, on focusing not just on political change, but social change. They're very more aware of injustices in society. Right? Instead of looking to the government to just regulate business, to fix society's problems. Right? To address things like civil rights, voting rights, other minority movements, education rights. But by the early 70s, I got to stress this to you guys like I have literally since September. Anytime society swings this way, we always swing back the other direction. It's very rare that the pendulum just sits on one side or the other for very long. It's the way of the world. By the early 70s, these new movements have created a bunch of chaos in society. Who doesn't like chaos? But conservatives in society don't like chaos. People prefer the status quo, the way things are. You know who likes the status quo? those that benefit from the status quo. Right, if you go back to MLK's letter from a Birmingham jail, it says no privileged group ever gives up their privilege by choice. Those that prefer the status quo, the usual, the conservative perspective, are those that benefit from that. So this silent majority pushes back with conservatism, a return to the status quo, a return to middle-class America mainstream values. What are middle-class American mainstream values? Think back to the 50s. That's middle-class America mainstream values. What are these values? The good old days. What else?
Having the same power.
Yeah. 2 kids and a what? And a wife. Ah, family values. Jesus values. Patriarchy values. Respectful values. Respect your elders. Respect your authority. Get out of the streets protesting. Cut your hair. Freaking hippie. Stop smoking weed in my house. This is America. We don't do that here. Thinking that the youth movements that we saw in the 60s are destroying traditional American values. And these two movements, the New Left and the New Right, give us our 6th party system. Look, it says president on the board. I just finished your PowerPoint for Monday, the last one of the year. It had Obama's face on it. I was like, damn. We started with Jamestown. Right? 1607 to 2007. Yeah, we spent all this time, only 400 years, really. That's wild. So, our 6th and final party system. Talk to me about what's new and what's the same here. Republicans are conservative. Is that new or continuing the same? Continuing. There's this new thing called New Federalism, of returning powers to the states. What's that called? States' rights. Yeah. Giving all this power the federal government's taken, this authority the government's taken, give these things back to the states. We'll talk about supply-side economics on Monday, but it's basically trickle-down economics that we'll reference on Monday. But privatization. Right? Why should the government do something that a private business could do for themselves? Interesting. This is new. The new Southern strategy. Yeah, the Southern strategy is very important for this. All these old Southern Democrats or Southern Dixiecrats becoming Republicans, that's called the Southern strategy. Appealing to the white, rural, working class. That's new. The Republicans did? Yeah, that's new as of the 1960s. This idea of what's called the Christian coalition or the moral majority, I'll talk about it Monday as well, but this idea of appealing to people's Christian morals, that's new in politics. We haven't done a whole lot of that. Judicial restraint, a big aggressive military, being much more pro-life. That's new, because we didn't have Roe v. Wade. We didn't have abortion rights before this. So this doubling down of Republicans on Christian values, on traditional values, that part's new. Their demographics, though, are pretty similar. Business. How long has business been in the Republican Party? Literally since the beginning. But this new addition of the blue-collar workforce. The everyday working class, over racial issues and other social issues, becomes more Republican. Then we talk about the Bible Belt. So what used to be like the Cotton Belt, this green area here, this middle of the country, now we kind of refer to it as the Bible Belt, because of their reliance on Christian values. On the Democratic side, more liberalism, which is a continuity since the 1930s. This new push for social welfare as a government policy is new. That's new, but it's really new since the Great Society, really. Some New Deal programs are more about social welfare. Keynesian economics, the government spending money to support people. That's been true for the Democrats since when? When's the first time we talked about Keynesian economics? New Deal. Government spending money when things go down. National health insurance, affirmative action for marginalized groups, pushing for the environment. Pro-choice for women's right to choose. That's a new, obviously, because we didn't have that beforehand. And their demographics are much more the educated. I won't say the intelligent because everybody's smart. But the educated, go figure. People that have professional type jobs, academic type jobs. Women, more so Democrat than Republican. Youth, much more so Democrat than Republican. Minorities, much more so Democrat than Republican. So you women in this room, you check every box. You are educated. You are a minority. You are young. You are a woman. Urban areas, union workers. And we much more see Democrats in the Northeast and the far west. The left coast or the west coast, because left is liberalism. But it's also the left on the map. Whoa, double entendre, the left coast. I like it. Good. So this is our new party system. This is our last party system. I don't have to talk to you guys about party politics anymore. Now, if you guys at lunch go back and look at the political party poster over time with all the presidential candidates, you can trace how all of this happens over time. First party system, second party system, third party system, fourth, fifth, and sixth, right? All the way from Federalists and Democratic Republicans of Hamilton versus Jefferson, where they're just fighting about the bank and the role of the federal government, all the way to now we're fighting about women's rights to choose. All the way through. So much has changed, but so much has stayed the same.
The Whigs and the Tories.
The Whigs. Oh, what are we still fighting about that's the same in the first party system? Roll the federal government. Yeah, roll the federal government. So nicely done. So let's talk about what's happening kind of after the civil rights movement. The government works. What you need, Kenny?
Here for you.
Excellent. Hey, how are you?
I'm good. How
What's
are
going
you?
on? Sit down and learn. Of course, you see it.
Even though I just finished finals, that's fine.
That's okay. We can learn some more. So post-civil rights movement, we look at the mid-1960s. We look at progress in the mid-60s. What are some of our examples of progress from marginalized groups in the mid-60s? Yeah, before that. So, yeah, Civil Rights Act of 64. What's next? Good. We have another Civil Rights Act of 68 that deals with urban housing and housing discrimination. So America, in typical American fashion, thinks to ourselves, we did what they wanted, now we're good. We gave them civil rights, we gave them voting rights. What more could they possibly be desiring of? But the problems in urban areas runs much deeper than just civil rights and political rights. Right, the problem in urban areas begins when? When do we first start seeing problems in urban areas? Gilded Age.
Strikes?
First, we see with Gilded Age, the first example of people being able to work farther from their workplace, allowing for our new middle class to move farther away. The 1950s was suburbanization. What do we call suburbanization? What's the other phrase for it? It's a good phrase. White flight. Good. White flight out of the cities. And what we leave behind is a lack of investment, a lack of money, a lack of resources, a lack of availability of opportunity, a lack of well-paying jobs, a lack of education, a lack of good infrastructure, and a really upset, minority-based, urban, lower middle class. And what we see by the mid to late 60s is people are pissed. People are pissed because there is, this shock me if this sounds familiar, police violence from mostly white police forces, no job opportunities. As the 60s economically are uplifting everybody, it's everybody but the urban minority lower class, and things are terrible. We see the first big example happens right here in Los Angeles, one of the first times we actually talk about LA in this class. The second time over a riot, the Zoot Suit riots in World War II, and then our Watts riots in 1965. Takes place in the Watts neighborhood. 34 people are killed. Thousands of people are injured. Billions of dollars of property is destroyed from a largely African-American driven riot over police violence. But all it takes is, when a community is very upset over a bunch of societal issues, all it takes is one spark. All it takes is one spark that then leads to a bunch of other fires being lit. I mean that metaphorically and legitimately. Other fires being lit in the society. This takes place, and again, we have to call out the National Guard, use the federal government's enforcement ability to put down this riot. Same thing happens in Detroit 2 years later, over a pretty similar context. In this case, though, we need the National Guard and tanks. Imagine seeing tanks in your own neighborhood. Right? This juxtaposition of America fighting Vietnam with heavy artillery and machinery, and at the same time using the same type of mechanisms to fight your own people at home. In Detroit, 43 people died, over 1,000 injured. There's other smaller examples, Watts and Detroit being the two big ones in the 1960s. And LBJ's pissed. LBJ is quoted as saying, "I did so much for these people. What more could they possibly want?" I don't know, bro. Ask them. The other one's right. I did so much for these people. What more could they possibly want? Is LBJ right? Yeah. Yeah, about the I did a lot for these people? Sure. Is he right in his perspective of what more could they want? Absolutely not. He's the one who wanted to declare war on poverty and then send the freaking check to Vietnam. Right? Understanding that all of this happens in like year 2 of his presidency, year 4 of his presidency. So, like, wars on poverty take time. You shouldn't be surprised then when people aren't happy right away. LBJ commissions the Kerner Commission, this group in the government, to look into why is there so much urban unrest? Why are people so mad? Why are people so angry? Why are there riots? And they came to the conclusion, this commission, that urban black people are really pissed, and they're pissed because of white racism. What? Since when? White people racist in the 60s? You don't say. We gave you the right to vote. We gave you civil rights. What do you mean racism? All right, again, to my point about liberalism, proving the point that you cannot legislate people's morality. You can pass laws that make racist acts illegal. You cannot legislate racism out of society. So what we see by the end of the 60s is a growing divide between urban minority populations, largely black, and the rest of white society. All right, well, really, if we look at this trend over time, what begins with white flight in the 1950s to suburbia, post-World War II, ends up in really pissed off black communities in urban areas. For good reason. The Kerner Commission attempts to improve interracial communication, largely without much success. And we've seen a whole bunch of other black and other minority riots in the years since, to be quite honest. Right? We have the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles of my childhood. Yeah, 92, which is crazy. Even like Ferguson, for example, in your guys' childhoods. The Black Lives Matter movement, the white police on black youth violence. So I would argue this problem really hasn't been solved, but it does demonstrate a limit of liberalism because of this fact that you can't legislate people's morality. Another example is Newark, New Jersey in 1967. Newark is a predominantly black city outside New York City in New Jersey. And again, you can see an example of the carnage and the damage taking place in urban areas there as well. LBJ's reaction. He tells CIA Director John McCone that these groups have nothing to live for. And in a sense, he's right. Right? They're looking at America progressing, America spending all this money in Vietnam, America making all these programs, and yet they don't see any change to their daily lives. Nothing to live for. 40% of them are unemployed. These youngsters, they live with rats, they've got no place to sleep, broken homes, illegitimate families, all the narcotics are circulating around them, and we have isolated them. They're all in one area, and when they move in, that's why we move out. How true is this in 1967? How true is this in 2007? How true is this in 2019? These are some of the problems that plague urban communities to this day, and things that our society needs to do something else to address. So a lot of this is what ends in this late 60s, early 70s era of revolt. The most dramatic focus of this new left that we just discussed is Vietnam Rebellion. All right, this Vietnam New Left protest movement is largely driven by college students who avoided the draft. Why do they avoid the draft? Why did they avoid the draft? Why did they avoid the draft?
I'm not going to Vietnam.
Why did they avoid the draft? Because they were in college. That's how they avoid the draft, by going to college. Who goes to college in the 60s? So they go to college. When you were in college until the very later years of the war, you can say, I'm not going, you don't put me in the draft pool to be drafted because I'm going to college. Who goes to college? White, middle, and upper class people. For the first time, we're seeing more middle-class white people go to college because of the GI Bill, because of the 50s success. But yeah, white people. So much of this protest movement is mostly young, college-educated white kids who are anti-Vietnam War. They're protesting the draft. They're protesting the use of college education for military research. And good on white people. They're protesting the disproportionate use of black and Hispanic soldiers in Vietnam. Why are black soldiers dying at a higher rate in Vietnam than everybody else? Why are Hispanic soldiers dying in Vietnam at a higher rate than everybody else? So good on our youth in the 1960s for putting aside racial barriers and protesting the real injustices in Vietnam. And as we talked about in class just yesterday with Kent State, the protests only get stronger as the fighting also intensifies. So what I want you to understand, though, is that this young people's Vietnam protest is contagious. Think about that. Most protest movements, most social movements are contagious. Right, when I told you guys this about class in freaking September, right? When you give people a right to do one thing, what do they want next? Yeah, right? When people start protesting one injustice, what might they see next? Other injustices. So we see growing out of first the civil rights movement. Got to give them credit for going first. What we see coming out of the civil rights movement of the late 50s into the 60s, and then we see coming out of the student protest of Vietnam, is a bunch of other protest movements. Because when you start looking at society's flaws, you tend to see more flaws there than you thought you might have seen otherwise. One of the first groups to then transfer the momentum of protest to their own problems are Native Americans. Native Americans create Red Power, the Native American protest movement beginning in 1961. They're going to do the exact same thing that the women of Seneca Falls did in 1848. Come together, write out their Declaration of Purposes. They're going to be very critical, for example, of the fact that the War on Poverty didn't have any programs for Indians. They're very critical of the fact that they've been put on reservations all this time and never given access to the real American dream. They've been very critical of termination policies to their treaties. So much like this is a good continuity in American history, about coming together as a group, voicing your concern, and putting it on paper. Thomas Jefferson did it once. Elizabeth Cady Stanton did it once. Johnson responds, as Johnson is apt to do, by creating the National Council on Indian Opportunity in 1965. The first example of America trying to figure out what we've done wrong by the Indians. Here we are, 300 some years later. But good on the Johnson administration for realizing this is the problem. Let's figure out what we can do about it. Like the rest of the protest movements, black, Hispanic, Native American, the movement gets more aggressive with time. I didn't spend much time talking about like Malcolm X and Black Power in our Civil Rights Day, but it is in your reading. In terms of even the black movement gets more, that's right, gets more aggressive as their needs aren't met. By 1968, the Native American movement has been kind of hijacked by a younger era of Native Americans, and their movement entitled Red Power. Of course, not mimicking, but copying the way that African Americans took on Black Power. And their big thing is to mock Columbus Day. Check them out. Do you guys get Columbus Day off anymore in school? No. You know what you get off instead?
President's Day?
Teacher Planning Day? I wish. No? No. We've changed, in California, we've changed the name from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, which is awesome. You don't get that off, though. But you know what you get off instead that people didn't get off in the 60s or 70s or 80s or 90s? Cesar Chavez Day. Cesar Chavez Day. Yeah. And then what becomes AIM, the American Indian Movement, also demonstrates its aggressiveness with much more militancy. Militancy. Yeah. Next Monday, I believe. The American Indian Movement, they get kind of aggressive. They conquer and take over the island of Alcatraz. You know Alcatraz, the jail? Yeah. Right? It's no longer being used as a jail by the late 1960s. So they go over, they take that, and they say, we're going to establish a Native American nation here on this island. And the government's like, what are you all doing out there? What are you guys doing? But they occupy, they hold Alcatraz for 19 months. As a show of solidarity for Native American separatism from the white population. Their goal, Red Power's goal, is to protect the Native way of life, to reassert and be proud of Native American culture. This is kind of like the anti-Dawes Act. right? The Anti-Dawes Act of the 1870s, which asked American Indians to be as Americanized as possible, and it says encouraging natives to embrace your culture, embrace your roots. It was them that invaded us and told us to change our life, not vice versa. So good on them. Going hand in hand with them is the Hispanic American protest movement as well. By 1960, and still true today, Hispanic and Latino Americans are the fastest growing minority in America. Fastest growing minority in America. As of 2019, the Hispanic population in America is like 18%, whereas the black population is about 13%. Good news. By the time you guys are 50 years old, which is soon, believe me, I thought it would be a long way from you two. Now I just turned 50 last year. Just jokes, Luis. Just jokes. You got run over by a 50-year-old speech. By the time you guys, I'll still do that at 50 though. By the time you guys are 50 years old, America will be a majority minority country. Think about that. That's why people are all scared these days. That's why conservatism is so scared these days. By 2050, there will be more people of minority, non-white descent in America than white people in America. I know, it's crazy. But that begins in the 1960s. Why does this begin in the 1960s? Why does this begin in the 1960s? Why does this begin in the 1960s? We overturned the National Origins Act. LBJ's presidency overturning the National Origins Act in the 1920s, allowing for a much more equitable, open, and fair, not perfect, not great, but more open, equitable, and fair immigration policy in America. Now, the Hispanic rights and Latino rights movement is very impatient because they feel they've been here for a long time without any real growth or progress or support. It is true that the Mexican Americans have been victimized by, for example, the Bracero program. Hey, come on in, we need you to farm. Followed by Operation Wetback, which was in your reading. Never mind, go back. We don't want you here after all. Right, which is just as much, that was actually a program designed by the Mexican government in their desire to bring back skilled farmers that they were lacking. So there's plenty of blame on both sides of the border in this case. Not in every case, but in this case. So really we see Hispanic Americans starting to mobilize around the what's called La Casa. And it really deals solely, for the most part, with the unionization of agricultural workers. The migrant workers that are largely in California and other West Coast states like Oregon, Washington, and to a smaller extent Nevada and Arizona, that are here to farm. They're migrant workers. They move with the seasons. They want to be recognized as a union. Migrant farm workers want to unionize, which in my opinion is the best example of Mexican assimilation into white culture ever. Right? White workers have been trying to unionize forever. Right? So this is an example of positive assimilation, of embracing the struggle of other lower class workers in a way that is very meaningful. Cesar Chavez, of course, in 1965 is the most important of these. Again, he modeled himself on MLK of nonviolence, strikes. The Cesar Chavez La Casa movement is encouraging Americans to not buy specific produce in solidarity with the striking agricultural workers. My mom was born in 1960. And she still, I didn't know this until like last year. I was talking to her, so what did you teach today? I was talking about it. She's like, oh, I remember that when I was a kid. When she was a kid, she remembers her and her family refusing to buy grapes. Because the Cesar Chavez strike was asking people in California, don't buy grapes, because that will hurt the farm owners who are the ones profiting from these grapes until they give us a pay raise and some legitimacy as a working farmers union. So my mom who knows nothing of history, she knows enough to know, but nothing of history, is one of these ingrained memories of her childhood. She didn't know why at the time. She didn't know why until last year. She remembers her mom saying, no, sorry, honey, we can't buy grapes. And she was sad because she loved grapes. And I wonder why we ate so many grapes when I was a kid. That makes more sense now. So, these movements do have some power and some legitimacy. Just like every other movement, it gets a little more militant and aggressive with time. By the 1970s, we see Hispanic Americans walking out of schools in places like East LA. The East LA school walkout, school boycott in the 1970s, asking for bilingual education. Saying, like, how can you expect me to learn when you can't even speak to me in my language? Right, especially for early childhood education. And then it's this and this in the shadow of the African American civil rights movement that leads into other minorities like Asian Americans, etc. So go ahead and give me a quick read of Jesse Lopez de la Cruz, a woman's perspective on La Casa, which is going to kind of demonstrate that even in movements of progress, movements of change, you'll still see some of the same societal struggles for the one big marginalized group that is still the most marginalized group in society. Take 3, read that, and respond to the question for me. You reading it? You lie. Go for it. What's up? What's cool?
I'm trying to record it early.
Yeah.
I just,
Still recording?
yeah.
You have 2.5 minutes to finish reading.
I'm still deciding if I want to go get my master's.
Do it. Get as educated as possible.
Yeah. And that's you. I know. I thought we were on the phone. Full of life.
You think you were younger for a while? I was younger. I guess I haven't changed that much.
It's been so long. But yeah, I'm trying to finish.
Okay. Well, I was just telling you. I don't know. I can't even go. Use that quick. Use that bony left hand of yours. The whole stack. Good. Good.
And I see a lot of new people here.
The cards? Remind me of it.
Yeah, I saw a lot of new people. That's good though. Really?
Two people are out. The bag is.
That's good. Hopefully I get to see her either today or I'm gonna be here for the college fair.
Oh yeah. I'll see. I'll make sure I make it in. I didn't mention that. All the alumni knows that she might have this today, but she's in the hallway. Who else do you see? Is it Mocha?
I'm about to. I just got here, so I've been really busy. As soon as I get back to work. My dad's still working. So that'll be really slow.
They lost me.
First and only time to have to win or lose.
Of course.
The whole damn family? 15 seconds. You're proving your point by saying that. All right, take a minute to talk to your partner. What is her big complaint? What does this demonstrate about social change? What does this demonstrate about the limits of social change? What's happening in this Hispanic Latino American movement for equality? 1 minute, shout it out. Go for it.
Why are women to speak up more?
The biggest thing that that's a continuity was that women feel like they not submissive, but like they basically gender her, right? They weren't considered like equals to men. That showed in the where
That's even like in the white
that's questions, but the men were
women
not
are.
treated.
See what I'm saying? So like the one group that can say across the board they are marginalized is women. Oh, the AD Gov test question I was going with the kids on Monday.
And what other
And asked, like, what's the most underrepresented group in Congress? But like most people assume the options are like Asian American, Black American, Hispanic American, women. And then the answer is women. Are there not enough black people in Congress? Yeah. Are there not enough Hispanic in Congress? Yeah. But half our country is women. And Congress is nowhere near half female. Cool. So, talk to me please, Kat. What is pointed out here by Jesse Lopez de la Cruz about the Hispanic and Chicano rights movement.
Okay, so one continuity was that it's still hard to be a woman organizer,
Yeah.
and that it's still the Chicano way that husband rules, and
Is that the Chicano way? It is, I know it is. Or is that just the human way?
oh yes, it's
Yeah.
great.
Good, I agree. Keep going.
And then it was saying how the men were better than the women, but they didn't want to take orders from the women.
What a concept. Where else have we seen this? Where else have we seen that idea? Where's that continuity from? About men being hesitant to involve women in social movements. Oh, and the abolition movement, yeah, abolition of women's rights. Yeah, Seneca Falls, all these things. Right? One of the things that first splits up the abolitionist movements is whether or not we want to allow women in leadership of abolitionist conventions. Keep going.
And then later on in the text, it was saying how women became more aggressive than the men,
Good.
and then men started kind of going along with it as women were elected.
Good, good. I would argue that's kind of a good continuity as well. Right? That women have been the ones advocating for change literally since day one. Ask Abigail Adams. Remember the ladies, right? And America's like, yeah, we'll get to that. So it's important we understand that one of these big driving factors in all of these movements is in fact the role of women, because across every racial demographic, whether you're white, black, brown, orange, yellow, purple, no matter, women are still more marginalized than men in every single group. And that is why our next conversation is about the women's rights movement. The women's rights movement, which has some success and some struggles. Now, you'll read a couple good texts in a second, but all of this, I'm going to argue for a really good synthesis opportunity for you. A real good synthesis opportunity. What led to Seneca Falls?
Women's rights.
What led to Seneca Falls?
The abolition movement.
Antebellum reform movement. Women are working on this project: education, temperance, abolition, prison asylum, and insane asylum reform. So women are working on all of these projects, and then they're like, wait a second, let's work on us. Vice versa, just like here in the 1960s, women are working on civil rights, voting rights, Hispanic Latino rights, immigration rights, all these protest movements. And then women at the end of this are like, wait a second, what about us? So in both cases, you see women involved in a bunch of other things that aren't even their own. And then realizing that they could advocate for some change on their own as well. So this idea of new feminism, pink power, is going to really begin with a very, 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 very important book published by Betty Friedan titled The Feminine Mystique. That should be on the first thing in your notes. This book questions why women are so strongly encouraged to stay at home and be housewives, right? Like they were. Here we are again, referencing the 1950s and conformity and staying home, raising kids, being respectful, all that stuff. So the feminine mystique is published from the point of view of a dissatisfied housewife who asks the world, is there more? Is there more to the world, or is this it? This book really launches a movement. You can compare it to like Uncle Tom's Cabin. Not that it launches the abolition movement, but that it really accelerates the abolition movement. And then Betty Friedan takes this social question of is this all, and starts applying it to politics and economics, etc. Betty Friedan co-founds then the National Organization for Women, NOW. The NOW, National Organization for Women, and they're going to advocate for women's rights. They're going to demand a new amendment to the Constitution. They're going to say, why do we have an equal rights amendment for African American citizens, the 14th, but no amendment that guarantees citizenship rights for anybody based on gender? The 14th says you cannot lose your citizenship rights based on race. Why don't we have one that says based on gender? It's kind of a good question. So the Equal Rights Amendment is going to ban sexism. It's going to ban sexual discrimination in the workforce. It's going to ban all this important stuff. As you guys should know, in order to get an amendment passed, you need a 2/3 majority in the House and the Senate, and 2/3 majority approval by, a 3/4 majority in the states. All the states have to ratify it, The House and the Senate both almost unanimously approved the Equal Rights Amendment. And that's where our good friend for today, Phyllis Schlafly, steps in. I will fight her. I will fight that woman. Phyllis Schlafly steps in as a woman and works to put down and stop this ratification of this new amendment to guarantee women's rights. Your wife? Phyllis Schlafly begins the Stop ERA campaign, arguing, hey, women, as soon as you get equal rights, men are going to demand equal things of you. And women are like, yeah. Yeah. So what we see instead, though, is this kind of begins, in my opinion, the demonstrating at the end of this like liberalism time. Conservatives, and what states don't ratify it? Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Arkansas.
Weren't there only like 3 states off?
They were 3 states short. 3 states short. Congress even extended the deadline to 1982. Didn't happen. So it went from looking like an easy amendment to get added, to give women equal constitutional rights. It gets shut down by the exact same states that we've been having trouble push for progress for a long, long, long time.
Even Texas.
Yeah, good point. Even Texas. Even Texas. Women, however, do get the right to abortion, which is not a case that gives women the right to abortion. Hear me out. I just taught this in AP Gov today. Roe v. Wade is monumentally important. On the backside of your page, it should be on the successes. You got to argue that the NOW is a success. Roe v. Wade is a success. And the Supreme Court does not say, abortion is cool, we like abortion. Because that would be a moral judgment. What they say instead is women have the right to privacy over their own bodies. If we argue that there's a constitutional right to privacy from government involvement in our private lives, then what's more private than your own body? So the Roe v. Wade is important because it grants privacy rights to women to make a decision on what's best for themselves in terms of sexual and reproductive health and childbirth. Big deal. Whether you like abortion or dislike abortion is not the point. The point that the Supreme Court has ruled, and I will fight you if you disagree, that women should have a say over what happens with their own bodies. Also passed in the 1960s and 70s is Title 7 and Title 9. Should both be in your notes as well. As successes, Title 7 and Title 9. Title 7 protects women from sexual harassment in the workplace. And Title 9, monumentally important, outlaws any sexual discrimination in educational programs. Yes, the reason why we have women's college sports is Title 9. Yeah. Because colleges... You guys can barely buy high school sports, pump the brakes. Now colleges have to spend an equal amount of money on educational programs for men and women. So sports are an educational program in college. So the reason we see women's sports, like women's basketball, women's volleyball, women's soccer, all these important sports, who would for sure dust the hell out of all of you in every single sport. Yeah, you get absolutely involved.
Yeah, we get destroyed.
Chavez, what sport could you be a college level woman in? Talk to me.
College level, no.
Thank you.
Once it gets
Not even get, like a woman. Oh, yeah, of course, Kenneth Parker Super, but also a woman who just happens to play at freaking East LA Community College will absolutely destroy every single person at this school of basketball. Facts.
East LA right now.
Yes.
in what football?
No. Okay, good. So, these two things, Title 7, Title 9, are monumentally important. What's the big failure for women? I ask you, where do they fall short? They fell short in getting the Equal Rights Amendment ratified. They definitely fall short in getting the Equal Rights Amendment ratified.
So anything like that ever happened like more recently?
There's been some movements recently to try to get this amendment re-ratified, but it would, in this era, it would face a significant. I see what you did there. In this era, the era would have a real hard time getting ratified. Sadly, we see protests, for example, at the Miss America event, which is I think hilarious. All right. This idea of comparing women to cuts of meat. Welcome to the Miss America cattle auction. Again, protesting what's these people are protesting what's happening, not saying this is what's actually happening.
Oh.
They're comparing Miss America.
Is it her?
What? Yeah, that's Betty Friedan.
No. The model in the.
Yeah, exactly. She's saying from previously that I've been compared to a piece of meat, so here we are. Let's break this habit of Americans of comparing women to pieces of meat. And then you force it in the front row and then do this exact same thing we're talking about college athletics. So you're not speaking. So, I have two good side-by-side texts for you. The first is from Betty Friedan, The Feminine Mystique, and the second is Phyllis Schlafly's response, The Power of the Positive Woman. So please, take 4 minutes. I'll give you 5. Take 5 minutes and compare these two views on what's happening women's rights-wise. Go. Try reading this one.
Is that why, like, sports video games add women teams too?
No, that's just by being good, by giving everybody a chance to think of themselves as the hero.
So you think 20 is going to get WNBA?
Good. Not by law, that's by choice. Do you have to play with them if you don't want to? There we go.
They'll keep FIFA, I'll be playing with them. They added women in FIFA. Yeah. They didn't add women.
Yes. What?
He was saying like how, we were talking about people, how they have women in it.
Cool. Read the questions. I'm glad they have women in it. That's good. That's because the society should acknowledge the fact that there's women and men that are at the top of their professions that would destroy anybody else that's below them.
No, I'm just telling them that they've been had a like.
Yeah, good for people.
4 or 5 years.
How much is it?
3 minutes. Compare the two views on the women's rights movement. How are they different? Where do they differ on the role of women in society? Teaching? It's also nice to say that guy not frowned upon, but encouraged more to risk that. As more women teachers than seen as an acceptable job. Teaching is still a very, maybe not here, but teaching is still a female-dominated field, especially the elementary level. Obviously. Imagine me teaching for 4th grade. Imagine. I'll pick somebody by their shirt or check out like a form. Go on. All right, sounds like we're done. Not quite sure why, when I still see blanks on people's pages, they want to have something to say. So those of you who are done, go ahead and have a quick discussion. How do these two views differ in terms of their views of the women's rights movement? Why is Phyllis Schlafly anti-women's rights? And what is Betty Friedan's big societal question for women? Take a minute to talk about it. Go.
First one, I said that she's saying that the reason why they have to go to North Side is because women themselves don't feel like satisfied with how they're living, getting like a routine life, like at the place, and then they feel like that's sufficient. And then the second perspective or whatever, saying that women, that they're only for the civil rights movement because
That's a good question, man. Laying in bed, like I did all this stuff. Say, that's how I feel. Let me yell at you guys today. All right. Let's watch that. Tuesday and third grade, and then yeah, so we don't. It's not even a boot camp for review. It's just you take a full day practice test and get a score. No. So, what is their difference? Talk to me, Luis.
Betty, she's saying that.
You don't know her personally, so we'll call her for Dan.
Okay, so she basically stated that women are afraid to ask, you know, to want change, to ask for change, and you know, she's saying that they have the same repetitive cycle every day, and then Phyllis, she's saying that she's kind of indirectly stating that women are pretty much useless, and she's saying that they have different mentalities and they value different things.
So since they have different values and different mentalities, why should they even ask for it? How could one amendment make them equal? Right? Betty Friedan obviously expresses this very dissatisfied housewife perspective. That question is fantastic. They do all this stuff and then lay in bed next to their husband and ask themselves, is this all? Right? Dissatisfied versus satisfied with the status quo. Phyllis Schlafly always obviously prefers the traditional role of women in women's spheres. Talk to me.
She basically like is saying like to stick to the role of being a housewife instead of like seeking for change
Yeah. Then why can't you be satisfied with the baby, with the family, with the home? Why isn't that enough for you? Right, so these two different views, obviously, and Phyllis Schlafly's political mobilization, which we'll call it, say, it's not funny. It's not. It's a real problem in today's society, and I don't think we should laugh at it. So, Phyllis Schlafly is able to mobilize public opinion. Obviously, it's still a public opinion problem today. In a way that keeps people from agreeing that women deserve, as humans, an amendment that protects their equal rights. Yes?
She's pretty much saying that without the woman in her, like, I guess, natural role, it's pretty much ruining the basic structure of an American family.
Yeah. And by allowing women to embrace this idea of equality, you're going to ruin the traditional American values of dad works, mom takes care of the kids, everybody's happy. Right? She prefers the 1950s view of the women. Absolutely. So all of this really, together, we consider a part of this counter or against everyday culture, this counterculture. This increase in protest, this increase in advocacy, this increase in liberalism, but also some of the more fun stuff, drugs. Drugs, we see by the end of the 60s, 60% of college students are smoking weed, or at least tried weed. People are taking LSD, which is wild. The music is reflecting this. People are wearing tie-dyed shirts, torn jeans, worried way less about their appearance and way more about their intellectual ability to have a conversation and think and enjoy themselves, right? Very self-fulfilling. We see this music revolution in the 60s, we've already referenced. But it also comes hand in hand with a sexual revolution and a movement for gay liberation. A sexual revolution and a movement for gay liberation. What's that? 60s into the 70s, yeah, definitely. A lot of what starts in the 60s carries into the 70s culturally. We have this debate about birth control pill in the 1970s. In 1970, 1/3 of fetuses in America are aborted. 1/3. Because we have not quite made advances in birth control, but we've definitely made advances in who we're having sex with. A lot more people. And it's in that context that Roe v. Wade is decided by the Supreme Court, which of course gives women the right to choose to do so if they so choose. What's up? Yeah, basically. We see for the first time in the 1970s publication of Playboy. This idea of freeing women to pose nude if they so choose, and freeing men and women to buy that magazine if they so choose. Right, of course, pissing off the Christian conservatives who are like, oh my God, absolutely not. Movies that reflect this new open sexuality. We see the divorce rate skyrocketing. Divorce gets easier to get. We have this new idea called no-blame divorce. You can get a divorce in which one party does not take the blame for getting divorced. You just get divorced because you want to move on with your life. We see a bunch more cohabitation of men and women just living together because they feel like it, not because they're married. And open marriages. Yeah, we're married, but I sleep around sometimes. What? She knows about that? Yeah, whatever. That's the 70s. All right, it's the 70s. Yeah, right? It's not like polygamy. It's like I have a wife, but I also like to go and run around and have a good time. We see like sex clubs in places like New York City where people just go and have sex. Yeah. Here's a good chance. Find a time machine, go back to the 70s. Now, yeah. Task 1, invent time machine.
Basically like Brave New World.
Yeah, in a sense, absolutely. We see an example, fun fact, I forget their names, but there's two New York Yankees, big famous baseball team, in I think it's 1972. Two pitchers on the same team are both like tired of their wives and they just trade. Right? They have a full on, just like that, a wife swap, right? And then one of the couples stays together, the other one doesn't, and then they just move on with their lives. Like, what? 70s are wild, bro. It's like trading in your car for a new one, Like, so that's for the women. So, also with this is gay liberation. We see a huge increase in public, open, accepted homosexuality. Still largely only in urban areas. The three areas of gay liberation that are most noteworthy is New York City, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. It all begins with the Stonewall Riots, a police raid on a gay bar in New York City, which leads to the gay community reacting with outrage, pushing back, having parades. This idea of gay pride, which is a phrase still seen in society today, is still first seeing in publication in the 1970s. Again, like most, this is a good continuity as well, most social change is supported in cities. Rural areas are like, not here. Marriage between a man and a woman. This here, America. But some important things, some very important things. In the 1970s, we've changed some stigmas. The American Psychiatric Association, as of the early 1970s, stops ruling homosexuality a mental disorder. Homosexuality is considered a mental disorder until the early 70s. So when we think about some of these social changes and social progress, this is crazy. What's up? They did it with transgender people recently. Yes? No, but I'm teaching English right now, so we talk about it much if you want. And this is a good continuity as well. Remember the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act?
Yeah.
The U.S. Civil Service Commission, who hires people for the federal government, they end a ban on gay employment, people working for the government, as of 1975. Not that long ago. Then now we have, as of 1975, the federal government can employ gay people.
When was gayness, or homosexuality first a mental disorder, like established?
As soon as the American Psychiatric Association was founded in the 1880s.
Like, when was all this legislation passed?
It wasn't necessarily the 1880s, 1890s, 1910s, any era of change. And all this gives us to our I already talked about this, the Democratic National Convention. Right? The big, you can make an argument this is the big, exclamation point which ends the 1960s, socially, culturally. All the protests End the war in Illinois, send the cops home. Referencing it's not just a war in Vietnam that's happening, but a war in American streets as well. There's the protest that I referenced in class yesterday. There are the police beating protesters at the Democratic National Convention that I talked about yesterday. And there's our election map, which gives us Nixon. Keep in mind that Republicans are going to benefit strongly from the Vietnam disaster. They're going to benefit strongly from all of this counterculture. They're going to benefit strongly from all of this upheaval and chaos. And Nixon wins quite overwhelmingly, with only the Northeast going Democrat and the Deep South going George Wallace. Here's Nixon on election day with his famous double peace sign that he'll use when he gets elected president, and he'll use when he leaves the presidency. And Nixon is supposed to be this reconciler. This guy is going to fix the division in America. He's going to fix American politics, fix all of this conflict, and instead he definitely just makes it worse. Just like he's going to fix Vietnam. Nixon makes a lot of promises to fix things, and then he tends to leave things worse than he found them. So, Nixon on the world stage is important. Nixon on the world stage is important. He embraces this idea of the Nixon Doctrine. That's his foreign policy approach, the Nixon Doctrine. And he says, we'll support whoever you are that's fighting communism, but not with our troops. You support Vietnamization as an example of this. That we'll support you with money, we'll support you with resources, we'll support you with what you need, but we're not going to send our troops all over the world to go fight other people's wars. Yes? Yeah, it's very much like the Lend-Lease Act. It's even kind of similar to the Truman Doctrine. That we'll send you what you need, just not troops. And we're going to gradually withdraw our presence from other places in the world. So gradually from Vietnam, gradually from elsewhere. All right, this Nixon Doctrine. We'll be a helpful partner, but we're not the one to fight these wars. I already talked about Vietnam yesterday, about the bombing of Cambodia, the bombing of Laos, the gradual retreat, and then losing the war and just bouncing. The secret bombing of Cambodia, the invasion of Laos, etc. But 1972, as you guys know, we end the war. By 1973, we're gone, and the North Vietnamese win by 1975. Very nice. But the whole perspective of Nixon's presidency on Vietnam is let's do whatever we can to put Vietnam behind us. Let's not learn from it. Let's not accept our failures. Let's not accept our struggle. Let's just put it behind us and move on. It's an important trend for the 1970s that I want you guys to acknowledge. Right? That when America makes a mistake, let's just move on forward and put it behind us and then keep on trucking. Because the same thing will happen with Nixon's resignation and Watergate. We already talked about the defeats, why they defeated. But the thing I want to focus on more so is Nixon does have some successes on foreign policy that we have to give him credit for. The first is his policy of détente. Détente. It's another French word, I apologize. I told you you were done with French after laissez-faire. Coup détente? No, it's coup d'état. Détente is this easing of hostilities. Let's turn the pressure down a little bit. Who else tried to pursue a policy of détente? JFK, right? This direct line to Moscow after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Let's take a step back from the ledge, right? Nixon tries, after brinksmanship, exactly. So détente is important. And Nixon realizes he's playing a three-dimensional game by this point. We have the U.S. here, the Soviets here, and the Chinese here. So what Nixon's going to try to do is try to make sure that we're buddies with both of them, because that's going to piss each other off. All right, to keep this wedge that first starts over Vietnam and other things, keep this wedge between the Chinese and the Soviets. And by doing so, he ensures that America doesn't have these two big powers fighting against us. He's the first president to go to China post-communist revolution. He goes to China in 1972. It's a big deal. It's not a big deal to you. I promise it's a big historical deal. Nixon goes to China. He formally, for the first time, even though they had the revolution 20-some years prior, he gives formal U.S. government recognition to the communist government in China. Which I told you guys the first day of this lecture that we didn't recognize their communist government. So we recognize China. It's called ping-pong diplomacy. It's true. We have this big ping-pong display. If you've seen Forrest Gump, it'll sound familiar. In which the U.S. and the Chinese have this ping pong tournament, and it's, you know, it is what it is. But it demonstrates détente, a lessening of tensions. I'll be watching again after a push, and you'll have a whole new appreciation for it. It's the second movie we watch after the test. Forrest Gump. Remember the Titans. School integration. Which one? The original or the new one? It's about Black Slave Rebellions. It's awesome. All right, back up. 72 also, he goes to Moscow. So in the same year, he goes to China, goes to the Soviet Union, and he creates the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty of limiting how many weapons both sides are going to have. So I got to give Nixon a lot of blame on what happened in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. The way we just bounced from Vietnam. But I'm going to give Nixon credit for what he does with China, for what he does with the Soviet Union in lessening tensions. And the 70s really are a cooling down of the Cold War. That's important for you guys to have in the back of your minds, is that the 50s, it's pretty tense. The 60s is pretty tense because of Vietnam. In the 70s, everything calms down a bit. Everything calms down a bit. So this is all good. Let's talk about some of the bad. Most of what Nixon does foreign policy-wise is secret. Nixon's going to use the CIA more than any other president to this point. Until towards the end of his presidency, we're going to have what's called the Church Committee. It's not actually about church. Sorry. The Church Committee, which is a congressional committee to investigate what the hell is this CIA we just created doing anyway. Keep in mind, one of the things that comes out of World War II is the CIA. It's brand new. And the U.S. is going to learn by the end of the 70s that the CIA has been doing things like assassinating world leaders, staging coups, doing all this shady stuff that's going to make America, again, trust the government less. The CIA has been paying for the bad, but not communist leaders in Iran, in South Africa, in the Philippines, and in Nicaragua. It was the CIA that assassinated the president of Chile and put in a regime that was friendly to the U.S. And this is happening all before Nixon's presidency, but also during Nixon's presidency as well. That's going to make a lot of these places in the world not the biggest fans of the United States. So this is more so a continuity of Cold War foreign policy of using covert actions in places where we probably don't belong. But we're supporting a bunch of. Why are we supporting all these leaders? Yeah, the Shah of Iran, for example, all sorts of terrible. We talked last class about these Pentagon Papers that Nixon tries to stop and the role they have in the Vietnam War, so I just wanted to mention it again because it matters. I brought them today if you're curious, as I told you I would. Yeah. There you go. Thank you, I've been working out. But let's talk his domestic policy. And there's two things you should know about his domestic policy. One success and one, I would argue, a societal failure. But that's just my politics talking. Now, Nixon enters office as a moderate, a reconciler. He says, I'm going to keep the Great Society in place. I'm not going to mess with these popular programs. I'm going to be middle ground. Like an Eisenhower. But then he's not middle ground. Nixon's going to shift a bunch, and this is going to sound familiar, Nixon's going to shift all these social programs and let the states deal with them. So these new social programs are going to push for progress, for people of color, for the poor. If he puts the states in charge of them, some states will administer them well. Other states won't. So this returning back to states' rights is really an end to liberalism. Liberalism is the opposite of states' rights, the federal government authority having these things. So Nixon's going to shift a bunch of responsibility for these programs to state governments, to local governments, to leave it off the federal government's responsibility. And this really liberal court has been making all these important decisions that we've been talking about, like Brown versus Board, a bunch of other ones you'll learn next year that aren't necessarily important for this story. It gets fully reshaped when 4 older justices retire, and Nixon gets to pick 4 much more conservative, older Supreme Court justices to replace them. So our next 2 eras in the Supreme Court, Burger Court and Rehnquist Court, are both very, very conservative. Very conservative.
So Nixon makes it conservative because of
His politics?
Because of his policies and because people lost trust in him?
Yeah. Yeah. Both. The last couple things to talk about on his presidency, this idea of new federalism is an important term, new federalism, and that's just putting things back on the states. So putting segregation policy on the states, school policy on the states, and every time Congress is passing a liberal type of policy, Nixon's vetoing it. Very Jackson-esque in his use of the veto against any sort of liberal type of policies. But some positives. He does expand affirmative action to try to get more minority workers in the workplace. In this court case, Griggs versus Duke Power Company. The big success of his presidency is here. The Environmental Protection Agency. You're going to read a text from a book called Silent Spring, very important, on a new era muckraker named Rachel Carson. Is going to publish a bunch of terrible things about pollution and chemicals. And the U.S. government creates the new Environmental Protection Agency to try to fix our environment. What a concept. Also worth noting, he creates Occupational Health and Safety Administration, OSHA, which ensures like workplace safety regulations. I taught it in AP Gov. I have to take the same freaking OSHA training every year on bloodborne pathogens. What happens if a kid bleeds in your class? You leave, you run. To create regulations on workplace safety. And under him on the home front, we see our first oil embargo. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, we'll talk about it again in a second, cuts off the U.S. supply of oil. And that's not good. We have a huge energy crisis under his presidency as well. But he does expand food stamps to some groups, Medicaid to some groups, but largely leaves the minority communities of color that are poorer behind. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes, just a quick read about the environment from Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. It's a very important book, very, very, very important book. This and The Feminine Mystique are both quite important today. So take 3 for Carson for me, please, and read. And what does Silent Spring demonstrate about, how is this a continuity in American history? 3 minutes. Read it, and then we'll move on. Go. After fast. You're reading. We don't have much time left, guys. About 30 seconds left. What is the strong continuity here? Or Teddy conservation? Or muckraker? No, yellow shirts is very different than Marco. Pro Spanish American War. All right. What's the big continuity here? What's the big? And it's not about the content of the text. What's the big continuity that is present here, Christoph?
What I feel at least was that it shows like continuity in all we do. We just benefit ourselves.
That's a strong continuity. Americans tend to do whatever they can to benefit themselves.
And no matter what we like hurt, whether it be people around us or things around us, as long as it benefits us, why should we care?
Capitalism, baby. Got a profit. Okay, that's part of it. Slane, what's another continuity here?
Well, I basically felt what Christoph said, but also it's pretty much the same thing, not caring about the environment, as he said, just seeing the benefit itself.
Okay. Brett, what else?
Continuity about conservation.
Conservation, sure. So like starting with Teddy's presidency, the Civilian Conservation Corps, sure.
You could also say that it's a woman too.
It's a woman. So women are always involved in social change. Good, Luis.
But there efforts being made to address the issue, but often efforts tend to die off quickly.
Okay. Good. Good.
Using the press and saying.
Yeah, using the press. The big continuity here is people using the written word to advocate for change, right? Just like the muckrakers of the Gilded Age, just like Michael Harrington, the other America of the 1950s, How the Other Half Lives, Jacob Riis, using the written word, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Thomas Paine, Common Sense, using the written word trying to push for change. So 1972, Nixon runs for re-election. Check this out. Nixon runs for re-election in 72, and he runs against Democrat George McGovern. And Nixon calls him the guy who supports the three A's, excuse me. He says, this is just he doesn't know anything about politics. He's an outsider who supports acid, abortion, and amnesty. Forgiving all criminals. He's just an outsider Democrat who supports acid, abortion, and amnesty. And that tells you everything you need to know about the Republican Party. Anti-drug, anti-women's rights to choose, and pro-punishing the hell out of criminals. That's the Republicans of the 1970s. Nixon wins the 4th largest margin of victory in American history. And he's out of the presidency a year and a half later.
Didn't he get amnesty?
He gets amnesty. He gets pardoned. He get amnesty. Isn't that funny? A lot of things Nixon accuses other people of doing, he's doing himself. So Nixon wins. Look at this election map.
Oh my
God. Yeah.
Wait, so which one was the biggest margin?
I would probably say Monroe. There's no opposition. Eric Feeling.
Oh.
Yeah, 4th, in terms of this as well, look at that. 96 points. Even the popular vote, he wins by a ton. He wins by a ton.
What's not one of those things?
So what does my election here reveal about the political beliefs of mainstream America? Take a minute, answer with your partner, answer the question. Go ahead, 1 minute. What does this election reveal about the policies of mainstream America? Yeah, oh, it's definitely gone. Yeah. All right, so talk to me then, please. Johnny, what does this election reveal about the mainstream politics in America in the 1970s?
I'm sorry, can you repeat?
Yeah, what does this election reveal about the mainstream politics of America in the 1970s? What does this reveal?
It reveals how like most of the people like are more conservative.
Okay, people have become more conservative. Liberalism is dead. Cortez pointed out that we're back to a little bit of conformity, where Americans are kind of back to doing what everybody else is doing and embracing these politics. So unfortunately for Nixon, though, during this election, his people do some dumb things. Of course, we talk about the Southern strategy, we talk about the election. Nixon wins, but less people vote. But during this election, people are caught breaking into and wiretapping the Democratic National Convention Party Center at Watergate Hotel. People are caught breaking into this hotel trying to steal secrets from Democrats. And turns out they're not some random thieves, but instead they are working for people that are working for Nixon. Nixon's very paranoid. Nixon's always thinks somebody's spying on him, which is why he's spying on other people. And the Nixon administration pays them $400,000 to keep quiet about this, because they don't want it to ruin the election. They keep quiet, but unfortunately, or fortunately, some investigative reporters start piecing together some clues. There's somebody leaking documents to them, pointing them in the right direction, and this it plays out on the front page of the Washington Post, the newspaper, for months and months and months. It's revealing that Nixon has been engaged in some really shady stuff. Eventually, the Senate begins investigating, and turns out that Nixon had no idea about the break-ins or the spying, but he was involved in the cover-up of the crimes, in the paying off of these people, and then in trying to fire people that were investigating him to try to keep justice from taking place. While this is happening, while the president is under huge investigation, big investigation, his vice president is also under investigation for fraud, bribery, tax evasion, taking bribes in the White House to give contracts to the people. So the president's under investigation, the vice president's under investigation. Who takes office if the president dies or resigns? Yeah, but what if the vice president is also under investigation?
The Capitol House.
Exactly, the Speaker of the House. Speaker of the House is a Democrat. No, it's not Ford. So what happens instead is these investigators are trying to figure out what the hell to do with America if both the president and vice president are under serious investigation. They force the vice president to resign by threatening to send him to jail for the rest of his life. Spiro Agnew is his name. He resigns and he's charged with tax evasion. And then the House of Representatives gets to pick a new vice president. They pick Gerald Ford. He was never elected to presidency or vice presidency. Now he's the vice president. And then Nixon has to resign because he's about to be impeached with all kinds of counts of all kinds of trouble. March of 1974, the tapes that Nixon has been keeping out of his paranoidness are subpoenaed or ordered to be released to Congress. The tapes show that he knows about the crime and he's helping to cover it up. And he basically then gets indicted on 3 articles of impeachment for obstruction of justice, lying to Congress, and something else. Then rather than go through the impeachment process like Andrew Johnson did or Bill Clinton did, he just says, you know what, I'm out. So this whole investigation, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post, they break the entire story wide open. This is twice now that our newspapers in the 60s and 70s really have done a good job. First on the Pentagon Papers, then on Watergate. Their investigation reveals that Nixon is guilty of obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and ignoring what Congress wants. The House charges him with 3, they're drafting 3 articles of impeachment, and instead of face the crime of impeachment, he just leaves. Here's in my opinion, one of the best memos in American history, written by President Nixon. I'll let you read it, it's pretty long.
Yeah.
Oh my. That is funny.
Yeah.
That's real.
That's real. That's the real memo of him resigning. He's like, you know what? Screw this. I'm out. I got caught.
Bye.
Nixon resigns and asks for a time of healing. Ford takes office later today, and there he goes. He leaves the presidency with the exact same symbol he joined the presidency with.
Is that real?
Yeah, that's real. He walks out of the White House and he's gone.
He might be my favorite.
This is the most American thing ever, right? Start a huge problem and be like, oh shit, I'm out. Gotta go. So Nixon is gone and now Ford is president. Was Ford elected to the executive office? No. The Watergate scandal, though, truly, the president that we had just elected by such a wide margin is gone a year and a half later. It erodes people's trust in the government. We see a growing tension between the president and Congress, which can't solve our problems. America, by the 1970s, seems to be more at war with itself than any other country. We're not fighting other countries. We're not fighting communism. We are fighting ourselves. We are fighting America. This defines the 1970s politically. That's why I have it underlined in big bold letters. Watergate, plus the Pentagon Papers, plus the economy struggling, plus the Vietnam War, plus us feeling like we're losing the Cold War, huge mistrust in the government, a huge word of disillusionment, and people are just not happy. All those things. I'll tell them again. Watergate, Pentagon Papers, Vietnam War loss, the economy sucks, we'll talk about it in a second. That in the 70s, like all the happiness and prosperity and hope of the 1960s is gone. And issue in our boy Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford is seen, the reason they pick him for vice president is he's seen as a very honest man who's very honorable. First thing he does is pardons Nixon. First thing, the president has the authority to forgive anybody of crimes if they feel they're wrongly accused or they've overserved the Senate for a variety of reasons. First thing he does is pardons Nixon. And America's like, what the hell? Because Nixon, once he was out of office, could be charged with all these crimes and go to jail for what he had done. Now he can't go to jail for what he did. He's been pardoned. He's been officially forgiven by the U.S. government. Why did he pardon him? Because he wants to put the country back together, to heal. As you can see in this awesome cartoon, Nixon is trying to use decency and openness to glue back together the seal of the presidency of the United States, but it can never go back. Once something is broken, it doesn't matter how much glue you use, it will not look the same. Oh yeah, it kills his image. Ford's. Everyone's like, yeah, good, he's the good, honest man, he'll do the right thing, and the first thing he does is forgive Nixon. But America wants Nixon to serve justice for what he did. He also takes, to be honest, Nixon probably left at the right time. I mean, he didn't really have a choice. But he left at the right time. The economy is really starting to struggle. And Ford takes over, and the economy is struggling. We have a ton of inflation. Kind of like Martin Van Buren. Yeah. We're facing a ton of inflation because the government's been spending and spending and spending and spending and spending. What are the two most expensive things in the 60s? Vietnam and?
Great Society.
Yeah, the Great Society. Right? The War on Poverty, all those programs cost money. So the government spends and spends and spends and spends, and then we have a bunch of inflation. At the same time, we have a recession. Let me tell you, this is all bad. Inflation is when things cost more money. A recession is when people have less money. This together is called stagflation. It's a really bad situation. And things are getting more expensive, but jobs are getting harder to find. Stagflation. We have a stagnant economy, but our dollar's not going as far. Ford tries to fix it with what he calls whip inflation now, by calling for, again, very much like Jackson and Specie Circular, a tight money supply, so lessening our money supply to fix inflation. It just makes things worse. But eventually it's going to burst then. That's what the 1920s do. Also under his presidency, our OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Companies, they get mad that we've been supporting Israel and they cut off our oil supply. America with no oil is not in a good situation. So we have the oil crisis, gas prices soar, we have huge shortages at the pump. I know I didn't go over OPEC a ton, but OPEC is all the Middle Eastern countries that have oil, and Argentina, who also has oil. Right? They cut us off, they embargo our oil. For some reason, they embargoed us. Usually it's us embargoing other people. So we have no oil, the economy sucks, we have no gas, we have no jobs, we can't afford anything. He tries to continue the idea of détente. But under him, it's when Saigon falls and the Vietnam War is officially over. So Ford, not that it's his fault, but Ford struggles. This is my point about oil prices. Look at oil prices go up in the 1970s because we got cut off. What is it? If we get cut off by oil, what goes down? Supply. So therefore, demand and prices go way up. So prices go way up in the 70s. The same thing's going to happen under Carter's presidency and make it worse. So this map, this chart, more than anything else, demonstrates like how crappy the economy in the 1970s ends up being. We don't go into a Great Depression because of fail-safe things, regulations of the economy that don't allow that to happen, like the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and jobs. Yes, sir? And then, is there a way to fix this? It takes time. Like in a recession, hang on guys, in a recession, according to Keynesian economics, what should the government do? Spend more money, like the New Deal. But if we have a time of inflation, what shouldn't the government do? They shouldn't spend money. So in the 70s, the government's like, we don't really know what to do. Because his economic theory is that when the economy sucks, the government spends more money. What if the economy sucks and we have a ton of inflation? That means that we don't really have an answer.
So Keynesian works to fix a recession.
A recession. Here's an example of the gas crisis picture. I love this picture. Yeah, they only have an odd number license plate for your last number. It's your day to get gas. You can only get 10 gallons max, or less than half your tank. Remember, there's not enough gas for everybody. So this is when we first started seeing speed limits, which originally is 50 miles an hour, not because it's a safety issue, because it's a gas issue. Yeah. And this is my point, that our economic growth is going down, our inflation is going up, and this is a time then of stagflation.
So it's not as bad as
Not nearly as bad as the Great Depression because we have all these programs in place that help the economy stay from going fully off the ledge. So 1976, Gerald Ford runs for re-election, despite the fact that things aren't going so hard, and we elect Jimmy Carter. He's a huge political outsider, seen as a good man. Jimmy Carter and Democrats win back the South. Interesting. I can talk about that more later, though. But because the Democrats have kind of walked away from civil rights, and everybody hates Gerald Ford. Everybody hates Ford, so Ford does not win his re-election campaign. And I just have a couple things to hit for Carter's presidency, and then we'll be done. The only reason Carter wins is because he's not part of the government. Right? Everybody hates the government. We hate him because of Vietnam. We hate him because of this recession. We hate him because of Watergate. We hate everything about the government. So Carter is seen as an outsider, and he wins a very close election, even closer in the popular vote, giving us this outsider president in a time that we don't trust. It makes sense. Right? Same reason that Trump gets elected in 2016. Carter tries to fix all these problems, and none of it works. Carter tries like 15 things. Inflation goes way up. Interest rates go way up. Things are getting really bad, and then they hit us with another oil embargo in 1979. Yeah, it's not good. Under him, we have a huge explosion of a nuclear plant, which the U.S. is like, fine, if we can't get oil power, maybe we'll invest in nuclear power. Boom, nuclear plant blows up. We're like, yeah, never mind. Never mind that. Which gives us a more momentum for the silent spring type move of fixing our environment. Right, this nuclear plant blows up, it ruins a whole area of soil, the air, all sorts of terrible. Backey versus Regents gets rid of quotas for minorities in colleges, which was an important thing in the 1960s. So domestically, Carter's got really a rough go of it. On foreign policy, it's actually worse. It is a real rough go. None of his efforts work. Inflation's high, interest rates are high, oil embargo means gas prices are high. The economy is in the dumps by 1979. And on foreign policy, it's worse. On foreign policy, Carter, as a good person, has a new idea. Check this out. We should stop supporting countries that commit human rights violations. What a concept. We should stop supporting crappy countries that are assaulting and violating the human rights of their people. But who are we supporting during the Cold War? Every country that does that. Every country that does that. One success is he begins pushing for peace in the Middle East with the Camp David Accords in 1977, bringing Egypt and Israel together. But under him, we have the Iranian Revolution. The people of Iran are pissed. Why are they pissed? Because they hate their government. Why do they hate their government? Because we put them there. Why are they still there? Because we're supporting them. The people of Iran overthrow their government. The Shah of Iran, and they instead put a much more radical, aggressive Islamic regime instead. In the process of doing so, they also storm and take over the U.S. Embassy and take 52 American hostages. 52 Americans that are working at the embassy in Iran are going to be hostages to this crazy revolution for 444 days. And Carter's like, come on, guys, give them back. Come on. Give them back. And they're like, no, death to America. Please give them back. No, death to America. What are you going to give us? We're going to give them back. Carter tries diplomacy. Carter tries to negotiate. Carter tries a CIA rescue that backfires. So he looks super weak because he can't bring these American hostages home. While this is happening, Russia, the Soviet Union, invades Afghanistan, showing that the Cold War we thought was calming down is heating back up again. So who does the U.S. support in Afghanistan because he's not communist? Osama bin Laden. And it is there that I will leave. The Cold War resumes. We have a new arms race that comes out of them invading Afghanistan. And the Cold War is no longer cold, but heating back up, which is where I will leave you. Generate.